Russia can handle all of what NATO is throwing at it.
Right.
So it's just like, why do we still want to keep this war? What's the point?
They've been regularly saying, providing as their reason for their support for Ukraine, just the need to improve Ukraine's bargaining position, strengthen their negotiating position so they can get a settlement that's favorable to them. Now, stop and think, what's happened over that period of time that they've been making this argument. Every time some European leader comes out and says this, it's always Ukraine's bargaining position is worse than it was the previous time somebody said that. It gets worse and worse, every day. It does. And there's no reason to believe that that's going to change. You can see the trajectory that Ukraine is on. So, what are you talking about? If you want to graph it, like their bargaining position, it's steadily dropping, declining. And so, you're making these statements. Well, where's the point where all of a sudden it's going to go back up and it's going to actually, is there any reason to believe that? Again, Mark Rutte is telling the truth about this. And then the Trump administration is also telling the truth about the lack of production capacity in the West. So, and then even if you could start producing a lot of weapons, the Ukrainians themselves are saying that we just lack the manpower. They're talking about conscripting women this fall. This is a desperate country, and just let's wake up to reality. If you love Ukraine, you hate Russia or whatever, you ought to, if I don't care that that's your position, you think Putin's a monster, well, stop the fighting, take the deal that you have, because it's getting worse, and it's been getting worse steadily for well over 2 years. The last time that the Ukrainians made any gains, was in the fall of 2022. That's nearly 3 years ago. And ever since then, it's gotten steadily worse, and that decline, in fact, is accelerating. So what are you doing? You're just going to wait. Well, because you refuse to admit the reality, you claim to be, you're so concerned with your own moral purity, you're going to sacrifice all of Ukraine.
But people like Trump, Mark Rutte, Zelensky, Starmer, all these people, they have to know that this is true. So what is the reason? Is it is it as callous as just, well, I don't want to look bad and we're making a lot of money with the MIC, so we'll just keep it going. I don't care how many Ukrainians die. When we say to the last Ukrainian, we mean it. I don't understand if they know that every day it's getting worse, that relative powers of Russia is increasing rapidly compared to NATO. NATO is just being exposed as a paper tiger that doesn't have any production capacity, that, NATO, the greatest fighting force in the world, but you have zero industrial capacity. So when there's a real war, you can't make anything. So why is it just a grift? Is it as callous as like the people in charge in Ukraine are just like, let's just keep the money flowing as much as we can, and they kick back to other people, everybody's getting paid, let's just let these people die and just keep it going, and then maybe we can make off as a bandit and, I don't know, live in the Caribbean or something.
There's something to that. That's part of it. There's, I think, no question about it. I think I just saw this morning, it was actually a statement by a Ukrainian dissident. Somebody who actually supports the Ukrainian effort in large, but is very critical of the government, and said, well, look, if this government were truly concerned about winning this war, why do you have this extensive corruption? All these people that have clearly been actually diverting resources that should be going to the front into their own pockets, and these people are still in power. So yeah, I think it's probably true of a number of people anyway in the Ukrainian regime. It is for them a grift, but then let's not forget the very real Banderite ideology that has become dominant in Ukraine over the last several years, and that is it is above all anti-Russian. It's just that seems to be at the core of it, is hating Russia. And for these people, they simply cannot, I think I've said this before, but it really seems to be true. They would, in the end, rather die. They would rather, that Ukraine itself ceased to exist and to actually bend their knee to Russia. I don't know if that's quite what they think, but that's the effect of what they think.
Is that just the people in charge, or is that, you think, the majority of the Ukrainian population now?
I don't think
West
it's
Ukraine?
the majority of the Ukrainian population, but it's an important minority. It's just that the Ukrainians made a real devil's bargain back in 2014, after the coup, the Maidan coup. At that time, the Banderites were fringe, but they had the most potent military fighting forces. And so when conflict broke out, it was really a matter of of this new regime attacking the eastern provinces, the Donbass. They had to pursue that war. They had to rely on these Banderites because that's where the muscle was, and it was true of the coup itself. Let's remember, it's like there was a false flag operation that preceded the coup. That was kind of the immediate cause of the coup, and it was again the Banderites who carried that out. They were firing from rooms in a certain hotel right there on the square. So they made this bargain with the devil. It's just like, okay, yeah, these people are kind of nutty. A lot of people in the Ukrainian government thought that way. They were really more interested in joining the West, but they had these Banderites. They're the muscle. They're the guys with the guns. They can do the dirty work. And so they did. And the problem is they fed the beast. And that over time, now they have I don't think they represent the majority of the people there, but they have taken control of certain important, certainly within the military. Now we have it's really the descendant of the Azov battalion, which became brigade, it grew in size, and now is an entire army group with 50,000 soldiers in it. 50,000 committed Banderites, heavily armed, and these people are willing to fight. They're not like so many of the conscripts. We can see clearly those people do not want to fight in the other units. So it gives them a great deal of power within the military, but it's also true, within various departments, education, whatever, that Banderite policies are being pursued. And I think there's no question that it's affected. They have control over the propaganda organ. Zelensky himself has become, in so much of his thinking, a Banderite. He originally wasn't, but it's just like that's the atmosphere. They did this bargain with the devil, and that's what they're becoming certainly at the top. Now, I think it's affected the thinking of a lot of Ukrainians, but as far as I can tell, it's not like they're really sincere believers in this ideology. And they would just as soon, again, that this war would end. But they just, the larger population really doesn't have any say in things. There are no elections, and, they don't have any control of these institutions. They're just, they're victims of this.
Do we know what percentage of recruits in Ukraine are being forcefully conscripted now, or is that information not really publicly available?
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
I saw something 75%, but I don't know if that's true. So I didn't want to.
Yeah, that's believable. I mean, it's actually I've seen reports from Ukrainian commanders, just complaining and say like these guys just don't want to fight. And now I didn't see any firm numbers, but you're talking about a majority. Like most of these people there, they haven't been trained. They don't want to be there. Sometimes they do fight. Well, they do because they get stuck to save their own lives. They start shooting, right? That's what happens. I think that happens in every war to some extent or another. As part of this instinct for self-survival kicks in and makes some kind of soldier out of you. But they're not very effective soldiers. They don't want to go on assaults. They don't. You need the crazies to do that. I don't know. I don't have any firm numbers on that. But I think it's clear. I mean, it's not just all the videos that we've seen, but that their recruitment efforts are failing. Their efforts to mobilize the population, they're falling short, and the Ukrainians themselves are admitting that. So if you had a lot of willing members of society, then that would not be a problem, right? They would be signing up. And then they, in that the 25 and under category, which is now off limits to conscription, for the time being, they did have a voluntary program. They have something very similar to what the Russians are, have been doing. They did offer really generous packages, as the Russians do, but they get a lot of young men and sign up for this. And
In Russia.
in Russia,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we were talking about something like 35 or maybe even 40,000 a month. And that's been going on for a long time. Now, they tried to do the same thing earlier this year in Ukraine, and the response was pathetic. It was admitted to by the Ukrainians themselves. We're talking about hundreds, 500 in a month or something like that. So there just isn't that willingness to go to the front, even with a generous package. So yeah, I think that 75% figure is probably correct. Maybe even higher than that. There's just really no desire on the part of individual average Ukrainians to go out there and fight this war, for a government that they recognize as corrupt. Maybe they hate the Russians, but they don't want to get killed by the Russians.
Do we have any idea what the casualty numbers are, or do you think we will ever find out what they are?
It really is hard to say. And all I can say that it appears to, if you just look at the Ukrainians, they are hurting for manpower. They themselves say that their various battalions are often at less than 50% strength. They are bleeding men, and they're not able to replace them. And just so the fact again that people are so afraid, even with generous offers, to go to the front, that suggests that the Ukrainians themselves, maybe they don't know the numbers, but they know it's bad. And that doesn't give us a firm answer, but it's got to be very bad. I mean, the loss of manpower. Why do they have that loss of manpower? A lot of their men are being killed. And then in Russia, they continue their voluntary program. Yeah, they offer these generous packages, but if it was really bad for the Russians, even if you say, well, I could really make a bundle out of this and get a good start in life if I go and sign up for this. But yeah, but it's a 1 in 10 chance I'm going to get killed, or and another 20% chance that I'll be severely injured or something. You look at that and say, no, I don't want to do that. They have to have a sense, because they have friends that have been in there and they talk to them. That's how it is. That's how it's going to be in any country, and the losses are real. Clearly a lot of Russians have been killed over the course of the last 3 years, but they're not so bad that this recruitment effort has run into any obstacles. But on the Ukrainian side, clearly it has. And I think that speaks volumes, even if we don't know the exact numbers.
Right. It's interesting how these ideologies sort of capture a country or a government. We often, when you see these people in power, politicians, you don't think about just that there's one overriding ideology that develops the worldview for a whole system. But that's what we kind of have. We have Banderism, that's the taking control in Ukraine. And then we have Zionism that's taking control, Israel, but also within the United States. And I think prior to October 7th, I think most people in the world didn't really look at our politicians and see that there was this ideology of Zionism that was guiding a lot of our foreign policy principles. Mm-hmm. But now it's becoming apparent that there is this, that how does that happen, that we just get that an ideology can just creep in and capture and take control of a whole government system and unleash all this chaos?
Well, I think it's a well-known fact in political science that it's like groups that are highly motivated and organized, even when they're numerically very small, can have an outsized impact. They can end up like winning the battle, so to speak. You may have a country, you can do the polls, 90% of the people think this way, but there's a group of people with 5%, and they are really committed. The others, it's 90% mush. It's just like these are not. They're maybe just kind of inherited habitual opinions, not really deeply felt in many cases. And then you have these people that are committed zealots, and they can by seizing the commanding heights of the culture really enforce their opinion. They can shape the views because that majority is soft and malleable. Unfortunately, it's true. Most people just don't have a real, firm, really, really firm principles. They just try to get along and, be a part of their society. And when their society changes on them, well, okay, they just they change with it. And they're not, often they don't understand that, well, it's changed because there are people who work to make a change. Those are the people that are really committed and zealous. And Zionism is an example of that. And I think Banderism is too.